Good morning, good evening, everybody. Yazan here with Vigil for Gaza, and we are very excited today to welcome Dr. Assal Rad, who's a historian of the modern Middle East and an expert in policy focused on the U.S. foreign policy in the region. She's done a lot of great work studying Palestine and Iran, and currently she's a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. She's also the author of The State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. A lot of us follow Dr. Rod on social media uh, because she's done a lot of amazing work being the go-to fixer of media headlines. Through the whole genocide in Gaza, she's done an amazing and incredible work picking apart ways that the mainstream media has tried to repaint the picture of what's happened on the ground and what's taking place in Palestine and in Gaza in particular, through adjustments of syntax and grammar and word choices. And for all of that work, we're very grateful and are excited to have this conversation about Palestine, Gaza, and the region in this moment where the war has extended beyond historic Palestine and has gone into Lebanon, Iran, and more. So welcome, Asal. Um, the first question I have for you is uh, the way we like to begin all of these conversations in this series to try to talk about a particular moment or a person in Gaza or Palestine that has resonated with you during this genocide. We like to do this because we believe we have to continue to humanize the victims of the genocide and honor a lot of the people we've lost because none of them are just numbers. And we would love if you can share with us one moment that has resonated with you.
That must be or exploited or controlled or civilized by Western outside powers. And what's interesting is we've sort of come full circle. There was a period of time where that's not, we wouldn't you wouldn't see Western powers use that kind of language so overtly. But now all of the sort of niceties have been shattered along with international law and norms. And you hear that exact language, right? You hear that from Israeli leaders when they talk about Palestinians, referring to Palestinians as human animals, the idea that, no, there are no innocents in Gaza, that kind of language. The savagery versus the civilized is becoming much more in use. But when I think of it's so hard because there's so many people that you feel like you've gotten to know over these last 2.5 years, if you
Hmm.
followed the events in Gaza closely. The
Hmm.
one that always sticks out to me, and it could be because, recently there was a film about it actually, The Voice of Hind Rajab. But the story of Hind Rajab is one that always stands out to me
Hmm.
because it's such a horrific story. And yes, there has been a film made about it, but the story of the film itself, the way that it was presented to the public, the
Hmm.
challenge that that film had in getting, producers or um, getting into theaters in a country like the United States. I mean, if that story was about anyone else,
Hmm.
wasn't Arab, who wasn't Muslim, who wasn't specifically Palestinian,
Hmm.
I can't imagine that there wouldn't be it would have been a challenge to get it into every theater in the country
Hmm.
because the story is horrific. And the way that it was framed, all these headlines that you can still go back and look, the BBC, something like, you know, got Hind Rajab, girl in Gaza found dead. The idea
I
of
think
a
young woman is the phrase they used.
young woman
Yeah.
is one of the just the idea that she was quote found dead,
Yeah. Yeah.
as opposed to having been killed in this
Yeah.
horrific manner.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's one that always sticks out to me, and you see these attempts to, I hate to say humanize because Palestinians shouldn't have to humanize themselves. They're human. It's ridiculous that we have to talk about it this way. But to at least counteract that process of dehumanization has been to tell these stories. And that's why I think that one has always stuck out to me.
I I I agree. The point you made earlier really stuck with me, the idea that we think we have a free press and that we have a democracy, but the more we've gone in the last 2.5 years have exposed the depth of how much of that is an illusion, that there are uh, controlled spaces that you can, or there are rules that there's a limit to what you can say. There's a limit of who you can support. And unfortunately for Palestinians and maybe the Muslim world at large, solidarity with them lies outside of the permissible. And in the work to manufacture consent to dehumanize them, I think we're finding that the press isn't very free. Uh, when you have top-down direction that goes to them to no, you cannot say Palestinian, you cannot say genocide, you cannot say so many words. Where uh, usually we hear about authoritarian regimes are the ones doing this, and here it seems to me that we have a certain set of rules that give an illusion that make people believe that this is truly free press, truly free democracy. But we, the last 2.5 years have made it really not not real and exposed a lot of the holes in that narrative. And do you feel, as someone who's in the industry, um, or closer to the industry of the press, do you feel that people are having an an existential crisis, realizing that we don't really have a free press, or that there are that many red lines that they can't cross? Or how has it been um, from the inside?
So I will say, and this is funny because I've people sometimes think I'm a journalist, and I'm not. I'm a historian, but my focus as a historian has often been on narrative construction. How the
Hmm.
story is told is so important, not just the
Hmm.
policies themselves, but how they're framed and presented to the public.
Hmm.
And I think that's actually especially true in a democratic society because in a democracy, you're presenting information. There's a responsibility for elected officials to present information to the public because, in theory, it's the public who is electing these representatives to carry out their will, and so they need accurate information in order to do that. But I can say, as someone who has made a lot of relationships with journalists, because I've
Hmm.
one of the things I always say is my criticism is not of individual journalists. It is of
Hmm.
the institutions
Hmm.
that uh, you know, limit what journalists can actually do. And, an example of this is there are multiple journalists who resigned their posts. They resigned.
Hmm.
You had journalists that resigned from the New York Times. You had journalists that resigned from Reuters, from BBC, from CNN, all because, and while resignations may have been more rare, even though they occurred at all of these major institutions, you did have a lot of pushback within them, within these newsrooms. So there was, I mean, if you're a journalist and you're out there trying to do your job, which is really to expose the truth, that's been one
Hmm.
of the problems in understanding like what is the role of the journalist. When, for instance, I and so many others criticize this idea of, Israel says as a way of presenting
Yes.
information. Well, it doesn't really matter what Israel says. What matters is what is true. The
Hmm.
job of the journalist is to expose the truth, especially, and this is the whole point of a free press versus an authoritarian press. It
Hmm.
is it is to challenge the state. We're supposed to be allowed to do that without any repercussions or consequences. That's the whole point of the freedom, is that you can say, hey, our government is lying to us, actually. They're not even telling us the truth.
Hmm.
So you rely as a public on this institution to shed light on that, and that's not what we've seen in the case. And you could make this argument for foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy more broadly. But especially, I think what happened with Gaza is people were getting from social media and from online activism and from the work of Palestinian journalists on the ground, and that can never be emphasized enough, that
Hmm.
Palestinians, not only, you know, journalists working in the field, but citizen journalists, people who were just videotaping and sharing what was happening,
Hmm.
people were seeing images and then they
Hmm.
were seeing the story be told to them, and
Right.
it didn't match. It didn't match up. They were being told, hey, they're targeting Hamas, but then you would get dozens of kids killed in a day,
Hmm. Hmm.
every day. You had UNICEF coming out and saying there's a classroom full of children being killed every single day.
Hmm.
But this is not the way that the story was being told. So to me, I think there's a distinction between the journalist and the institution. And you have actually examples where journalists came out from places like CNN and they said, well, it feels like there's a very clear pro-Israel bias in the way that we are being told to filter this information. If you followed the State Department briefings under the Biden administration,
Hmm.
um, there were a lot of journalists in the room that were trying to challenge what the administration was saying. But, the responses that they got were, I would say, dishonest in many cases, or
Hmm.
just tried to evade the core issues in most cases. So I think there's an overall problem with the media ecosystem. And this is not a new argument. If you go back to the work of Herman and Chomsky in
Hmm.
19, I think it was 88 or 89,
Hmm.
that the book Manufacturing Consent was first published. At that time, the lens through which they looked at the way that the media was manufacturing consent had to do with the Soviet Union and the
Hmm.
Cold War context. When they updated the book in the early 2000s, the new sort of enemy that information was filtered through was the war on terror, right? So this
Hmm.
is the way that a narrative is curated, and it's
Hmm.
subtle because it's about the words you choose to use and especially the words you choose not to use, the things you
Hmm.
choose not to say. And that was explicitly stated in some cases during the Gaza genocide, like a New York Times memo in spring of 2024 that was leaked saying, hey, don't use the word genocide.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's an explicit instruction from higher ups telling journalists, don't call this what it is.
And uh, yeah, I mean, you are exactly right because you touched on um, the work of Chomsky and also Edward Said before, and where we are today is the 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 two of them coming together show and it's reaching a very obvious point where you cannot escape how insidious that is. I would say, unfortunately, for um, people who are trying to manufacture consent, the availability of the new technology from social media to live journalists who are able to broadcast and share with the world has made it a lot more difficult to control the narrative compared to the 80s when
Which is why they started trying to control those.
correct, correct. And I think it's going to be a game of cat and mouse until they figure out if there is a way, if at all possible, to achieve full control over it. But we're finding that it's much more difficult or complex when people have the freedom to do it. I wanted to ask you, what was the first moment you realized it's important to attack those headlines and start fixing them? I know you've done it before the Gaza genocide, but what was your light bulb moment that, okay, this needs to be fixed? Do you recall or?
There's, like I said, because I've always focused on the way. The reason why narrative was always important to me is because as someone who studied the history of the Middle East, it wasn't just, an academic exercise. I wanted to understand sort of how we got to where we are, because I may have naively thought that in terms of policy, right? When
Mhm.
policy is made, if I came of age during the war on terror and the US invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Hmm.
And there were already, I mean, there were people shouting at that time, like, we're entering into a war based on lies. It wasn't something that no one knew. People were
Right.
criticizing it at the time. But somehow we just, barreled right into what was one of the, it's called in the US, it's called one of the worst political blunders of the 21st century. Um, I'd like to say that for Iraqis, it was much worse than a blunder. We're
Hmm.
talking about mass war crimes. We're talking about not just unleashing horror across the region. If you look at the cost of war study from Brown University, I think they put the numbers of the war on terror and somewhere around 4 to 5 million people killed.
Hmm.
Um, you're and those are direct deaths. You think about secondary deaths, the conditions that have been brought about, the continued securitization problems that has been caused from it. I believe that the understanding that would help us to make more sound policy. And again, we live in a democracy. So the idea is, well, how is the public consuming
Hmm.
information? How is the
Hmm.
public understanding this? If you look at polling from 2003, before the invasion of Iraq, a majority of Americans believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and played a role in 9/11. Both false.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
there's a huge disconnect between fact and reality and the public knowledge of it. Now, people can criticize the public, I guess, and say, well, why aren't we more educated on, these issues? But that's not really, not everybody is studying the history of the region. Not everybody is studying political science or paying attention to everything that's going on. So where do they get their information from? How are they getting these ideas? It's coming from the media. So
Hmm.
that's where the idea of manufacturing consent is so important because you're actually giving people, not only you're not correcting the record, but you're giving them false information. And based on this false information, we're, moving forward with certain policies. So that's why the story was always important long ago in my mind.
Hmm.
I wasn't on social media actually until I think like 2019, like I was late
Hmm.
to the social
Okay.
media game. As a graduate student, it wasn't something that I really did. But it was the first time that I remember where it was sort of this, I guess viral moment was actually the uh, uh, forced expulsions in Sheikh Jarrah in East
Hmm.
Jerusalem. And this is back in 2021. And I remember there was a New York Times headline that just stuck out to me because it said something like, evictions in contested neighborhood,
Hmm.
uh, like spark Israeli-Palestinian conflict, something to that effect, right? But the language was evictions in contested neighborhood. And I was blown away to see this headline because I thought,
Hmm.
if you don't know, if you do not follow this closely and you look at that headline, you're thinking, oh, well, it's not clear who this land belongs to. People are being evicted. Maybe there's, a real estate dispute that's going on. And that's how they want to present it to you. That's not the reality of it. East Jerusalem is occupied under international law. That is international law. And don't take my word for it. Take the international criminal, like the ICJ, the highest court in the world in July of last year, I believe it was, again concluded Israel's occupation is illegal. But somehow that's not the way that the language was. So I corrected that one to use different language. I think I crossed it out and called it, ethnic cleansing.
Hmm.
Using obviously much more harsh language that if people see that, they have a very different reaction than seeing dispute contested neighborhoods or language like evictions. But the fact that actually Palestinians were being forced from their homes, homes that they had lived in for generations. So that was the first time it really sparked a public reaction. And I continue to do it to some extent, but like everything else, I think the genocide in Gaza brought a lot of things to people's attention. The fact that, this idea of hypocrisy and double standards within the Western world just became so clear, especially during the Biden administration, because you saw the difference in real time as they dealt
Hmm.
with Russia than when they dealt with Israel. The fact that the Biden admin after 15 months of being in office, never once concluded that Israel had committed one single war crime. And yet, within 10 days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they'd already concluded that Russia was committing war crimes. They denied genocide in the case of Gaza. Biden called Ukraine a genocide after a month.
Mm,
So to have seen this happen in this way, it really compelled me at least to focus on, well, what is the media doing? Are you correcting the record?
mhm,
Are you saying, are you debunking stories like 40 beheaded babies because it's not a real story, but the president keeps saying it? Or
mhm.
are you just, repeating atrocity propaganda and whitewashing these horrific crimes that we're seeing take place every day? So it's something that I have done for some time, but really became an everyday practice during the Gaza genocide.
And it's been very, very effective and useful. And I'm seeing a lot of people pick up on trying to do it themselves as well, even in casual discussions with other people. Um, and I guess despite all of that narrative control, we're still seeing a strong shift in public opinion. The latest polls as that track the favorability of Israel or where Americans have their sympathies are showing a strong swing where Israel's favorability is the lowest it's ever been in the American public, and the sympathy with Palestinians is at the highest. And and that shows that the limit of the narrative control that has taken place, that there are the amount of atrocities that took place over were much higher, and they overcame all the control that was put in place. Um, but how do you see it moving forward? Like, is this um, surge of sympathy towards Palestinians in the American public a transient moment, or is it something that will continue to increase? A lot of people use the term once you see it, you cannot unsee it. But based on your reading of the history and your understanding of the whole apparatus from film industry, news, media, all of the above, do you think that momentum that's carried us to this moment is reversible, or uh, are we are we really seeing a breakout that just cannot go back?
I think that, I mean, if you, in the long term history, history has an ebb and flow. So
Hmm.
and it's obviously very difficult to predict what will come. So I can't say where we're going to go necessarily, but I do think it is safe to say that we have lived through and are living through a watershed moment. And
Hmm.
that shift that you're talking about, I don't think it's transient. I don't think it's something that's just I don't think you can easily reverse it.
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm actually one of the people who will also agree with the idea that once you've seen, for the people who saw a live stream genocide, um, I mean, I can speak for myself personally, that changes you. It changes for so many people I've seen who didn't. I mean, I've followed events in the Middle East, specifically Palestine,
Hmm.
since I was an undergraduate student, something that I've always been interested in.
Hmm.
But I've seen people who never paid attention, who didn't really know anything, because they didn't follow it. It would be something that would occur occasionally. There would be some
Right.
kind of conflict, and they didn't really understand the depth of it or the history or any of that. But there was nothing to sort of prompt wanting to understand more. And I think we're living through a different period now, and that's why you see this massive shift. The shift comes from the level of atrocity that Israel carried out. There's just no
Hmm.
other way for me to say it. I mean, if you think about, in a sort of sad irony, but if you think about anti-Semitism, for instance, in
Hmm.
the Western world, anti-Semitism in the US and in Europe,
Hmm.
anti-Semitism was something that was around for a very long time before the sort of worst culmination of it, which was the
Hmm.
Holocaust. But what changed was what people came to understand as these horrors that had been carried
Hmm.
out against Jewish peoples in Europe. And so it broke through, anti-Semitism was also based on propaganda, right? So it broke through that all of the layers of propaganda. Because I think there is a natural or visceral reaction that human beings have to seeing that kind of violence against innocent people. And the reason why I think children were emphasized is not because Palestinian men and women, innocent Palestinian men and women, were not slaughtered in mass as well. They were. And their lives are absolutely as important. But I think what happens for people, for, just an average person who doesn't know anything, you don't
Hmm.
have to know anything when you know that thousands of children are being killed. Information is no because nothing can justify it. Nothing in someone's mind can do that. And I think that's why we've seen the significant shift. On top of that, what I think people are waking up to, especially in the United States, is just the amount of influence and sway the Israeli lobby holds in the United States. And we're seeing that now manifest itself in a war that no, like very, very few Americans actually wanted.
Hmm.
The US war with Iran right now is actually the has the least popular, because usually wars have a rally around the flag effect. We can
Hmm.
look at the Iraq war now and think, oh, well, nobody wanted the Iraq war because there were so many protests. That's not true. If you look at polling at the time, the majority of
Hmm.
Americans supported the war. So
Hmm.
usually a majority of the country has supported wars that the United States has entered into. This one started out as a minority. And given the consequences that we've seen so far, and the fact that no one has been able to articulate what was the point of this, what is the point of continuing this, what objectives have been accomplished through this war, there's more public discussion about, well, you know who did want this war? Israel.
Hmm.
It's the truth, right? If you look at polling and compare polling in the United States and Israel, a majority of Americans did not want the war in Iran. A majority of Israelis do. They did. Um, the the US government is providing billions of dollars in aid to Israel every year.
Hmm.
Many Americans have argued now for a long time, but we need those resources. Israel is not a poor country. Why
Hmm.
are we providing our tax dollars not only to a country that doesn't actually need it when our own people should be our first priority, but also a country that is carrying out an apartheid state that has now carried out and committed a genocide, is carrying out ethnic cleansing and annexation in the West Bank, is ethnically cleansing Palestinians in East Jerusalem, is occupying Lebanon, is occupying Syria, has bombed all of its neighbors. I mean, the amount of instability that has been created by what is an ethno-nationalist expansionist state that we are, for whatever reason, funding has become a bigger and bigger question in the US. So, no, I don't think it's something that you can just go back on.
Hmm.
I think at least a generation has been lost
Hmm.
for in terms of support for Israel.
Hmm.
And we're seeing that in the most, I think, striking, example is the fact that you're seeing it on the left and the right.
Right.
It's not
Yes.
usually something that you see, but you're seeing a complete shift because the common factor is young people. Young people experienced something that will change them. And I don't think people can understand this enough. Having watched a genocide live on your phone is not something that we have ever done before. And so
Hmm.
I don't think it's a moment that you can't put it back in the bag.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and that does give me hope. I do feel that a lot of people have lost faith in the mainstream media and are starting to ask more questions than before. So we don't take things for granted. There's a lot of people who are doubting the the narrative that they're hearing, and as they start to ask questions, they find out that, oh, Palestinians did try peaceful protests. They had the Great March of Return in Gaza, and that nobody heard about it in the West, when the image that they have been fed in the past was purely, oh, they're bloodthirsty savages who want to kill people. And I think there's a reprogramming that has taken place, particularly, like you said, with the younger generation who maybe hasn't spent their whole lives listening to Fox and CNN and all of these outlets as their trusted sources because they're used to consuming some of the social media online. And Do you um like do you see the cultural portrayal of people from the region, Palestinians and the broader one, in that in that context? I mean, Edward Said talked about it from a long time ago, how the Arab and Muslim world has been portrayed in Oriental uh, language, and but do you see that changing again because of the same reasons? Like, are people able to connect better because they see videos on social media of Iranians or Palestinians sharing similar interests to them, speaking in a way that they can resonate with? Is is that able to bring them closer to what we said earlier, to humanize people across the world in a way that wasn't really possible when you could only read it on a newspaper, for example?
I mean, I think all of these mediums are important. Um, the fact that you have independent news media more and more, like as a growing space, rather than these like legacy media. A lot of people will say things to me like, "Nobody reads the New York Times," and I wish that was true, but it's not. Like,
Hmm.
you still read the New York Times, but we can get into that later. But the idea that there are alternative media sources, that we have social media, which by the way, like social media has is good for very many reasons, but it's not this utopic space. It can also,
Hmm.
especially as you have more control exerted on that space, there's tons of disinformation and misinformation on
Hmm.
social media. So it's not just every platform and
Hmm.
every medium for communication will have positive and negative depending on how it's used. In terms of the changes, I think part of the problem is when people are not exposed to a certain culture or a certain group of people, right? We're told over and over again, and I can only say this anecdotally from what I've heard and seen in the last few years. I have seen a lot of people say things like almost remorseful for having thought a different way.
Hmm.
There are some things about, people having converted, for instance, to Islam because they've been told, and this isn't to say, it's not I don't know how to say it. Like the point that I'm trying to make is more about how one religion, how one people, how one region has been vilified in such a way that once you saw, and I think this is especially true of the men, if I'm being completely
Hmm.
honest, right? So I
Hmm.
remember seeing so many scenes of Palestinian men embracing Iranian men, embracing, crying,
Hmm.
um, searching for their families, taking care of children. Now, if you are someone, I am of Iranian heritage myself. This is
Hmm.
not surprising.
Yeah.
This is normal life.
Yeah.
This is how our fathers and our brothers and our friends, this is how they interact with us. Like this is
Hmm.
the idea that those images were shocking to people almost shocked me in a way, that people
Hmm.
actually publicly stated things like that. But they have been so dehumanized that the simplest things, the simplest actions that show you, we have culturally people can be very different, but we have the same aspirations. People, their first priority is not shocking, their children, protecting their children. Why? Because one of the Israeli talking points is that Palestinians, I think the phrase is, they wish that Palestinians loved their children more than they hated Jews. This is
Hmm.
literally something that Israelis will say. Palestinians are happy. It's okay if their children are killed or they die because of this deep hatred they have. It's insane the kinds of talking points that have been used.
Hmm.
And they've been said over and over again to a point where people started to actually believe this. That's not the case at all. Palestinians, like every other person in the world, have care deeply about their children and want to protect them. So I think seeing it not in a film, right? It's good to have it in popular culture as well because it reinforces the thing that should have been obvious to begin with. But when you see it in real life, it becomes undeniable. And I still say, I mean, when we say, what does it mean when we say Palestinians are dehumanized? saying killing 400 people in one day, which is what Israel did when it shattered a cease, or 100 people, sorry, in one day when it during a ceasefire, and not calling it a viol and still calling it a ceasefire is dehumanization of Palestinians. If 100
Mhm.
Israelis had been killed, they would never call it. They would say that ceasefire is shattered. It's gone.
Mhm.
There is no ceasefire. But Palestinians can be killed on a near daily basis, still called a ceasefire. That is what dehumanization looks like in real time.
Mhm.
When they're just numbers, when their stories and their names are not something known or talked about. So it seems like while it took, and it shouldn't have taken such a horrific slaughter, massacres, daily massacres, for people to start to see Palestinians as equal human beings, to a certain extent, that is actually what has done it. That is what
Mhm.
has broken through the sort of barrier of dehumanization. But it still exists. That language is still there. The idea that Palestinians are not victims.
Mhm.
Palestinians can never be victims. Israelis are always victims. An Israeli soldier is kidnapped. A Palestinian doctor is detained. He's
Mhm.
called a prisoner. The other one is called a hostage.
Mhm.
These word choices make a difference because, again, one side is always victimized and the other one is basically incapable of being considered a victim. And the group that's incapable of being considered a victim publicly is the one being occupied, who's indigenous to the land. So it's this, when you start to realize it, and that's what I mean when I say I think we've moved past this sort of moment. When people start to realize the level to which they've been propagandized,
Mhm.
that's why I think there's such a distrust in not only our officials, but also in our media. And why people look for now alternative sources because they don't trust the media anymore.
As they should, given how corrupt it's been. Um, what sources of alternative media do you think people should try to um, use? Are there ones that you feel are more trustworthy, and do we think long term even these will remain free and not co-opted, or uh, are they going to come after them as well?
Well, I mean, who is they and who are they coming after? That's something that we can't, what we can do is try to engage honestly in conversations, to seek the truth, and to do that. I like to have a as many sources as possible. One
Mm.
of the things would make sense is to follow Palestinian journalists. Follow, not even, you can follow Palestinian journalists and media that's actually from the region, um, as well as independent journalism and independent outlets that now exist. As examples, something like Zateo News or Dropsite News, both of which were founded in the wake of the Gaza genocide as it was unfolding.
Mhm.
Um, Social media is also good if you follow particular people who are on the ground telling you what's happening. One of the things that I would keep in mind always is that I wouldn't rely on any one source. So it's not
Mhm.
something being trustworthy or not trustworthy. The other thing I want to say, and this is actually really important, legacy media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Associated Press, Reuters, all of these media institutions, they have a lot of good coverage, actually. That's the
Mhm.
interesting thing. They do. It's not to say that they're not covering what's happening at all. But you have to be able to read it with a particular lens, knowing that they might give you the information. The information is there. But if you
Mhm.
read it for the way that they try to present it to you, then you'll always read it in this sort of good guy, bad guy framework where, again, Israel is always the victim, Palestinians are always
Mhm.
the aggressors, even though Palestinians are the ones who are occupied. But the information is still there. And so I think, I'll give you an example of what I mean. The New York Times did an investigative piece on the elementary school in Iran that was bombed.
Yeah.
And I think it was like the second day of the war.
Mhm.
100 and I think 68 or 75, the numbers differ, but
Mhm.
well over 100 children were killed that day,
Mhm.
ages 7 to 12. And, the immediate response, and this should sound very familiar, right? What was the immediate reaction when a clear war crime had been committed? It was a misfired missile by the Iranians.
Mhm.
Okay, Does that not sound exactly like Al Ahli Hospital, which was in October
Exactly.
2023?
Yep.
Because when an immediate horrific crime is committed and it creates this public uproar, the reaction of the states is to deny it and to blame, Hamas or blame Iran in this case.
Hmm.
New York Times actually did a great investigative piece that basically said I don't know if they concluded it or said it is extremely likely that this was a US missile. The investigation was very important. They took their time and they did it well. The framing of the headline was horrible.
Mm.
The framing of the headline, and I can't remember it exactly, but it was something like, amidst US strikes on uh, like Iranian military targets, this elementary school got hit too.
Mm.
Kind of the way, again, to minimize the action of what happened or to
Hmm.
soften it just to the point where they're telling you the story. But, and I think it was also, it didn't say it definitively. It still had sort of vague language.
Hmm.
And so the argument that I made in that case is I'm like, look, this investigative piece is great. But first of all, does everybody have a New York Times subscription? No, so it's paywalled. Does everybody read, even though the ones who have the subscription? What do people usually see? If you're scrolling on social media, you're looking at the posts. That's what most people are looking at, right?
Hmm.
You're looking at things more passively. And so that first language that you use to frame the whole thing is actually really important because that's what people are passively consuming. They're not seeing posts over and over again that say the US hit an elementary school and killed 175 children, which is
Hmm.
what it should say.
Hmm.
So those sources aren't something to dismiss completely, in my opinion. I think that a lot of the journalists do really good work. They try to get verified information, but not to rely on them.
Hmm.
That is the main point. Like, don't rely on them because they're not telling you the whole story. There's a lot of things that they don't report. And the way they're telling the story is very like carefully curated. So that's really the criticism. But I would look at these other sources that use the direct language, that call it what it is. You
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
drop site and Zateo call Gaza a genocide. They don't mince words because that's what it is. So
Hmm.
there's no
Hmm.
argument about it. Whereas these legacy media outlets won't use that same language.
And do the journalists get that much say? I know some of them do good work, good investigative reporting, but then when it goes to editorial board, a bunch of red tape gets added and things get obfuscated. Um, how come we haven't seen enough repercussions or mass exodus of journalists or protests? I know we've had some here, some there, but maybe not to the level that one would expect, given the amount of overbearing control that has taken place. Um, and do
Uh,
they even have that much? How much say would a journalist have in the headline at the end
The
of the day?
journalists don't write the headlines. That's something
Hmm.
that's really important. I'm glad you brought it up because it's not I can say speak as someone who's written op-eds, right? I'm not a
Hmm.
journalist, so I don't write articles, but I write opinion pieces and those get published. And as the author, I don't get to choose the title. Very often the title gets changed. I don't necessarily like them always.
Hmm.
I don't get to pick the thumbnail image that they use.
Hmm.
Sometimes I've not liked that either, because it's
Hmm.
not my choice, it's an editorial choice.
Hmm.
The in when New York Times journalists get instructions saying avoid these words, they're being told outright, don't use these words. So they're being censored. I mean, that's the
Hmm.
word for it. You call it that in any other situation.
Hmm.
So they are being censored. And when you ask why wasn't there a mass exodus, I can't speak to the motivations of different people in different positions. I think there have been some resignations. There's definitely been pushback. There's been a lot of internal criticisms. But what I can imagine is that these are people who are trying, not everyone, right? It's not, there are journalists who have, you know, children serving in the Israeli military right
Right.
now.
Hmm.
seems like a conflict of interest to be
Yeah.
writing about Israel as a journalist who's supposed to be objective when your children are serving in the military that you're supposed to be writing about. So there are problematic journalists, but overall, as you know, I'm talking about the industry. I think a lot of them are trying to do good work, and quite frankly, it's their job.
Mhm.
It's really easy to say, well, why didn't you all resign and walk out? Well, because they probably have to have a livelihood and
Mhm.
take care of their own families. And this is the career they've gone into, and there's a lot of limitations. A lot of them have, like I use the example of Zateo. Mehdi Hassan was on MSNBC,
Mhm.
and he parted ways with MSNBC and started his own media institution. Not everybody has the ability to do that. So it's hard to sort of judge the idea
Sure.
of the individual journalists and what they're doing. And I think a lot of times they are trying to do good work.
That makes sense. I wanted to ask you, Asal, about Iran, just in the same lens of propaganda that we have seen. Uh, the protests that took place in Iran in earlier this year in January also received similar treatment by the media outlets here. There was some atrocity propaganda, made it hard to know what happened and what didn't happen, especially that we know there's little access to Iran itself from the government's control of what's taking place. But there was quite a bit of, I mean, the image of Iran that's sketched out here for the American public is in line with how the Palestinians are portrayed, generally speaking, but maybe it has also longer history, or for some of them, given the hostage crisis in the American embassy, and so there are some direct histories with America. Um, so how, like, what's your advice to people in terms of trying to better understand what is really happening in Iran and how to see with more clarity? I think a lot of people are able to now see Palestine through the fog of propaganda. Not everyone, but a lot of people have. But at least to me, it doesn't feel like the same people are able to do the same for Iran. There's still reluctance to see through some of the propaganda that's presented to us, and it doesn't get challenged, especially while we're openly declaring war on it as a country.
Well, the Iranian case and the Palestinian case are obviously very, very different. One, because, Iran is an indigenous population, its government is its own, made up of its own people.
Hmm.
Palestinians are occupied by a foreign entity. So
Hmm.
there's, in that sense, they're very different cases. And so the way that you talk about, criticism of a government versus its people is different in these two cases.
Hmm.
Um, One thing I think that does happen is, or that we should do, is distinguishing between the people and the government, of course.
Hmm.
One of the things that has been interesting to see in this sort of war and the way I'm actually surprised at how much public support Iran has.
Hmm.
Because to your point, Iran has typically been seen as this, um, you know, malign
Hmm.
threat that it's really interesting. And this is actually an Orientalist trope, as Edward Said
Yes.
would say, right? It's one of the tropes of Orientalism is that in the Orient, especially the men are simultaneously depicted as these sort of effeminate, weak, very easily dominated people, but then also these monsters that
Hmm.
everybody should be scared of, especially the women. Like this
Hmm.
idea within Orientalism, and interestingly enough, Iran is portrayed the same way. It's
Hmm.
either, one sanction away from total collapse. It's this weakened state. They're at their weakest point. They're always on the verge of collapse because they're so
Hmm.
weak. But at the same time, they're basically responsible for everything. They're,
Hmm.
they're, their hand, I mean, literally, you have official Israeli accounts that depict Iran as this like octopus, right? The
Hmm.
supreme leader at the top, and it has its tentacles everywhere. What I think is fascinating is when you see the two sides. None of this is to say that the Iranian government is not has done horrible things, especially to its own population. That doesn't mean that Iran's sovereignty as a nation
Mhm.
is now null. Whatever that government does, that doesn't mean that the US government and the Israeli government can go in and quote bomb them into liberation. I mean, we have seen this story. Oh God, we've seen this story way too many times.
Mhm.
And the thing is in this case, what was really interesting is how quickly it shifted from this is a rescue mission to liberate to, the US President Donald Trump saying things like, we're going to, a civilization will be
Die.
dead tonight, will
Mhm.
die tonight. A civilization.
Mhm.
The idea of completely crushing the entire society. Hospitals attacked, schools attacked, historic UNESCO sites attacked. Um, Oil refineries, gas fields, bridges. This is what makes up the civilian infrastructure of the country.
Mhm.
So if you're trying to rescue people, why are you trying to send them to the Stone Age? I mean, ridiculous that I'm not exaggerating, that this is
Mhm.
real statements from
Mhm.
our officials. So that story very quickly evaporated and it went from, we're here to liberate to we're here to dominate. But what I think is interesting in the Iranian case is it's really important to stay in the nuance. You can be critical of the Iranian government, what it does to it, and its repression of its own people, while simultaneously condemning an illegal war started by Israel. Two
Mhm.
nuclear-powered states fighting against what was not actually a threat. And that's the biggest thing, is Iran is always presented as a threat. I talked
Mhm.
about polling earlier. Let me give you another poll. I think it was 2021, Brookings Institute did a poll that found more Americans believed falsely that Iran has nuclear weapons than believed that Israel has nuclear weapons, even though
Mhm.
Israel does have nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
How do you, again, how do you end up with facts? These are facts. These are basic facts.
Mhm.
A simple Google search will give you, arms control center. You can look this up. Israel has nuclear weapons. Iran does not have nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
I think at this point, everybody would agree Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons because they probably would have tested one to say, hey, stop bombing us.
Right.
So Iran doesn't have them. Israel does have them. How do Americans get this fact in reverse? It's because of the way the information is presented. No one in the media talks about Israel's nuclear weapons program.
Mhm. Mhm.
Iran is still talked about. Iran's nuclear weapons program is talked about all the time. Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapons program. It has a nuclear program. Those are not the same things. But it gets repeated in a way and the threat gets inflated in a way that this becomes the perception. Despite all of that, still a majority of Americans did not want this war. They
Mhm.
didn't want
Mhm.
it. And we have, I mean, the idea that Iran was a threat to the United States is kind of absurd. Iran is a country that has been sanctioned by the United States for decades. Maximum pressure sanctions for the last 10 years that has crushed its economy. And this is
Mhm.
not something that I'm saying. This is something that repeat the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said, the current head of Treasury has said. I mean, this is
Mhm.
US officials saying this is what we've done to this country. If Iran was a threat to the United States, they could have reversed that, but they can't. So that I think is the biggest issue in the way that Iran is presented. It's, you know, tons of criticism is very, very valid and possible to make. That does not take away their sovereignty. That does not mean you can bomb them. That especially doesn't mean you can kill their civilians and target their civilian infrastructure, which has basically become Israel's thing, right? This is
Mhm.
now a pattern that we've seen in Gaza, we've seen in Lebanon, and now we're seeing it in Iran as well. So anywhere Israel goes, because once you get away with it, like once you get away with genocide, what's stopping you?
Mhm.
There's
Mhm.
nothing to stop Israel from continuing in this path. The only thing is if the United States actually decides to say, hey, you guys can't do this. And it's not because of the civilian populations of these countries that the US is intervening. The US is intervening in Iran mostly because it's causing global economic issues,
Right.
which anybody who knew anything about Iran could have told you that's exactly what would happen. So I think understanding that the threat was inflated much, much similar in the way that the threat was inflated about Iraq in 2003.
Mhm.
Iraq was not a
Mhm.
threat to the United States. There was no imminent threat from Iraq. Iraq was not going to attack the United States. So this whole notion of like preemptive attacks are really just it's new speak colonial language to say we're
Hmm.
just going to go and we're going to do whatever we want because no one's going to be able to stop us from doing it.
That makes sense. And speaking like of the Iranian population, after two rounds of the war, it seems to me that there's a bit of a rallying around the nation movement happening inside Iran. We see a lot of people that went on the streets in what looked millions every day, in, not in protest, but in support of the nation and in defense of the nation against the war that's happening. So, can you tell us a little bit of what's your read on what's happening on the streets of Iran? And is there a change in terms of thinking of the discontent with the government? For example, do people think that the main issue or the primary issue is the sanctions that have choked the economy to bits, as opposed to it being just purely the government mismanaging or being corrupt? Or where do people stand on it? Or is it too soon to even dissect how the Iranian population is reacting?
Well, there's few things there to sort of talk about because you brought up a few different issues. One I would say is while the sanctions have had enormous effects and negative adverse effects on not just the Iranian economy, but the way that sanctions operate affect other aspects of the state too, because it increases corruption.
Hmm.
It's ordinary people that can't get around sanctions. The state has the power to get around sanctions, so they do. Money has been more concentrated in amongst the elites, leaving basically decimating the Iranian middle class. When you start to have these massive wealth gaps, it also starts to affect, the fabric of the society. Uh,
Hmm.
we're seeing that not just in the case of Iran, but we're seeing that everywhere in the world. Those divisions that start to become so, like just the anger that people have. Just think about public discontentment in the United States, and we're
Hmm.
still, a very wealthy country, even though that wealth is being concentrated. But by comparison, we're still a very wealthy country, but you can see the public anger
Hmm.
towards the more that people can't afford things, the more healthcare becomes expensive, the more gas prices go up, the more food prices go up. Ordinary Americans are struggling and living paycheck to paycheck, and you can see the kind of effect that has on the society itself, the amount of division. That, of course, would be the case, if not much worse, in a country like Iran, where it's under sanctions that
Hmm.
are, I mean, you had the head of Treasury saying that look at what's happening in Iran. People are angry because look what we did to the dollar and look what we did to their money. I mean, they're taking credit for it. So
Hmm.
you cannot deny the role of sanctions. That being said, there are things that the Iranian government does that have nothing to do with sanctions. The
Hmm.
mandatory hijab is not a sanctions issue. That is an issue of their own social repressions. Vetting candidates, if you go back to the 2021 election in Iran, just like ultra vetting, any vetting of candidates, but the ultra vetting of candidates, that basically means even this sort of um, election process that is only representative of one part of the government because there's an elected body of government in Iran, but there's also the supreme leadership, which is not
Hmm.
an elected body, which ultimately has more power. That political repression, that has nothing to do with sanctions. Those are things that that government chooses to do, and they should be, and that should be recognized. Both of these things can be happening at once, which is really
Hmm.
why the position of the Iranian person is extraordinarily tragic, because
Hmm.
they're feeling pressure from all sides.
Hmm.
Like, their situation is not, over the last 10 years, their situation has not gotten better under maximum pressure. Their situation has gotten worse. The middle
Hmm.
class is completely decimated. So, when we talk about how can we help Iranians, I would say we could start by not being the source of pressure that actually actively harms them. I mean, one of the things, now you talked about the sort of the rallying around the nation or rallying around the flag. Also extremely important. Iran is a country of 90 million people. The it doesn't everybody doesn't agree. It's a
Hmm. Of
massively
course.
diverse population with a lot of different political views. There are people in the country that the Islamic Republic has a base of support. It's by no means, there's no data to support that it would be a majority, but it is significant enough that it would lead to, it would be a number of millions of people nonetheless. Even if it's 10% of the population, it's 9 million people. Even if it's less than that, you're still looking at millions of people because it's a large country. Um, there are people in Iran who welcomed the strikes, that welcomed the war because they are under so much pressure that they felt like anything is better than our current situation. Does that represent a majority of the country? There's no evidence to say that's the case. So what you see is people who are rallying around literally the nation, not the government, but the nation itself.
Hmm.
Because one thing, we don't have time to get into it here, but one thing to understand about the Iranian psyche is they're very, the idea of Iran as a nation is something that's believed to be 2,500 years old. You know, we're about to celebrate 250 years of the United States as a nation. In the
Hmm.
Iranian psyche, you're looking at least 2,500 years more.
Hmm.
The land, the map, the territorial integrity of Iran is extremely important to the vast majority of Iranians. And so when you have, when you have Israelis who are basically talking about partitioning the state,
Right.
this creates the self-defense. It's natural. It's a natural response to foreign powers that are attacking them. And maybe in the first days they felt like, oh, well, they're attacking and they're killing, they're assassinating these officials. But then they started to attack your bridges, and then they started to attack your oil fields, and then they said they were going to attack your power plants, and then they said they were going to send you to the Stone Age.
Hmm.
That's not an attack on the government. That's an attack on the people. So naturally, their reaction is going to be to defend the sovereignty of the nation, regardless of who is in power.
Right. 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 And that, I mean, that makes sense. And I guess in the ideal scenario for Trump and Israel, the war would have ended very fast, and they would have been able to capitalize on the decapitation strikes they've done. But the extension of it going into 40 days made it a lot more difficult to realize the goals that they had set up, and maybe caused this unintended consequence that you just described, when even the people who are discontent seeing the Minab school getting destroyed, the bridges, all of the resources, it makes one question what is really the intent of this liberation movement. And I know we're over the hour. I wanted to give some of the questions that the audience sent through to see how many we can get through before we can wrap up here. There is one question, Asal, about uh, there's often a tendency within the mainstream um, narrative to listen to either a Western or, in the case of Palestine, the Israeli uh, source much, much more than the Palestinian one or the Iranian one in the case of Iran. Uh, the question was more specific about Palestine, how there are stories that uh, talk about the Nakba or other atrocities that took place, and the Palestinians have been saying this for years and decades to us, but only when Haaretz has new evidence from Israeli sources to say the same thing, it only becomes accepted as reality. So how how should we make a change, or how can we influence a change in the as like for historians, for example, such as yourself, in terms of being able to push back against prioritizing that only the Israeli narrative or only the Western narrative is a valid one to listen to.
Well, that's a great question because it speaks to what sort of has to be changed.
Mhm.
Um, and this is on the level of the media itself,
Mhm.
because one of the things that you would see, I'll give you an example. When there was a story last year about 15 Palestinian medics that
Mm.
were
Yeah.
killed in their ambulances, buried in a mass grave along with the vehicles. Now, Palestinians were covering that story
Hmm.
themselves. They talked about this and these medical workers who had gone out and they never came back. They'd been killed. There'd been a massacre. No coverage in Western media.
Hmm.
Got no traction at all.
Hmm.
Then the UN aid workers uncovered the mass grave,
Right.
and suddenly you get coverage of it. So the first thing to do is listen to Palestinians. I don't know how else
Hmm.
to, it's the simplest way you could say it. Listen to Palestinians. Now, I myself will often use Israeli sources because the Israeli media will tell you what is going on more than Western media will. If you want to know
Yeah.
the daily pogroms that are happening in the West Bank, you're
Hmm.
going to find a lot more of an Israeli media than you are
For
in
sure.
American media or in Western media. If you want to know about, what is happening internally in Israel, the death penalty laws and all of these horrific things that they're doing, they're going to cover it way more. If you're going to hear about criticisms of the Israeli government, people who are saying, hey, these officials are openly using genocidal language, they don't cover it in Western media. They do. So I will often use Haaretz, for instance, to
Hmm.
say, look, if Israeli media can call it a genocide, there is zero reason why we're not seeing this in Western media. That is
Hmm.
not to valorize Israeli media, but simply to juxtapose it, to say, how is it possible that you guys can't do it when they're doing it, when even they are doing it? But the fact that we rely on it, like Palestinians were saying for weeks that when they were going to aid sites, they were being shot at.
Hmm.
When Haaretz breaks the story, all of a sudden it's a story. It is ridiculous that Palestinians who are the victims are not listened to until their
Hmm.
victimizers actually confirm what has happened.
Hmm.
So I would listen to Palestinians in the same way that you would any other news source. Palestinian journalists were being slaughtered, assassinated, targeted, and murdered. And you still had Western media headlines that said, well, Israel says they're part of Hamas. Just
Hmm.
insane things that justified the slaughter of their colleagues. But because they were Palestinian, this was allowed to happen. So, the simplest answer, I gave you a long-winded answer. The simplest answer, listen to Palestinians.
It's a perfect answer. But how can we turn that into history? Right now, I question a lot of the history that we have learned because we saw for the genocide in 4K on our devices, yet the official history that's written is very different than what we've seen. And I'm having a hard time believing that a lot of the official history that we learned about so many conflicts in the past is equally reliable. I mean, who's to say that this is a new phenomena that's taking place? I would not bet anything that this is new. And this manipulation of history is probably a very old trick in the book. So how can we, moving forward, tackle and push back on that? How can we rewrite history as it's happening now and future proof it so it does not fall into that
I don't think
bucket?
we have to rewrite history because the people who are writing, I mean, there's already a lot of literature and more is coming out. I myself am writing a book project that is on the Gaza genocide. So there's a lot that's already been written and more will be written about what has happened. In terms of, how do we look at these sources? Well, there is a difference between the actual sources. I mean, you're asking me as a historian. As a historian, we have to source our information. It's not just
Yeah.
my opinion that I'm writing. There is there is an archive or something that I'm pulling from to say, look, this person, Netanyahu, this is a quote. He said
Mm,
this. I'm not saying it.
mm,
I'm telling you he said it. Here's the
mm,
evidence. Here's the link, something like that. So looking at history itself, when you talk about it, I mean, that's why Said's work is so important. Edward Said's Orientalism,
mm,
I think it was published in 1978 or 79. It's still influencing the way that scholars work in the field. I mean, any young scholar of the Middle East is so indebted to his work
mm,
because he gave us an ability to do exactly what you're saying, to go beyond the way that even on an academic level, the way the information is presented, and realize that you can scrutinize them too. Uh,
Hmm.
Max Weinreich has a study called Hitler's Professors. And the
Hmm.
entire point of the book, and this was written, I think, back in the 1960s, was to say how these institutions that we, believe in so much were centers of anti-Semitism.
Hmm.
You could get a PhD on the Jewish question at the time, right? So
Hmm.
they legitimize it in all of these different ways. These institutions legitimize whatever atrocities that are being carried out. The same thing has happened in the case of Palestinians. And that's why Orientalism was so important. It was to say, look, even when you're going to a university and you're studying these things, it's completely warped a
Hmm.
reality. So we have a lot of history that's actually been written since then in the last 4 or 5 decades that including from Palestinian and Israeli historians that have completely changed that narrative. One of the things that I thought was a happy thing to see in the last couple of years is so many people reading, for instance, the work of Rashid Khalidi, who's
Hmm.
a renowned Palestinian historian. Those that's the way I think you can see that it's already happening, but by actually reading the sources and looking at the source material, how is this historian or this scholar or this person talking about this issue? What are the sources that they're giving you? I know nobody likes to look at footnotes or endnotes, but they're actually quite
Exactly.
important.
Yes.
Footnotes and
And
endnotes are so important because it tells you where they're getting their information from.
yeah, and that is I mean, part of the issue is like why headlines are so important and the work you're doing is so important because a lot of people don't spend the actual time reading the whole content and checking the sources. It's historians that do it, but for the average person, they're forming an opinion based on a sentence or a sound bite. And I think that's in some sense the challenge in terms of how to form the overall public opinion beyond just scholarship. Um, and
I'll say,
uh,
look, what we're doing is challenging the status quo. You're challenging
yeah,
power. The
yes.
entire apparatus of power, when you say Palestine has a right to exist, when you say free Palestine, you're challenging the status quo of power in the way that it currently exists. So
Hmm.
it's not going to come without challenges.
Hmm.
We're
Hmm.
going to, it's going to come, it's going to have costs, it's going to have challenges. But that's always the case when you try to go against what elites want to maintain. Um, I don't think that that should sort of negate the struggle to do so. We should continue doing it, essentially. We have to continue doing the work. I mean, that's the easiest way for me to say it. It's not going to be easy, but we have to continue doing it.
Agreed. Agreed. And I think we have time for just one last question on Iran that's come in, and it's also asking you as a historian, are what would like and your understanding of that society if the coup in 1953 did not succeed and if Mossadegh stayed in power, do you think the trajectory of where Iran was headed, how would that have played out with the regional powers at the time and into now?
Uh, that's an extremely difficult question to answer because I can't, I can't predict an alternative history. What I can say is the 1953 coup had massive consequences for not only Iran, but also for the United States. I mean, it was basically like a prototype of, oh, we can just go
Hmm.
overthrow governments if we want to and sort of install people that are more aligned with our point of view. It also, not the coup itself, but what led to the coup, the fact that Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil. Obviously, the British were not happy about that because they really
Hmm.
liked just taking oil that didn't belong to them. But it's in the early 50s that happens. It's after that, for instance, Nasser in Egypt
Hmm.
nationalizes the Suez Canal, right? So there are these movement. This is all part of in the post World War II world order. The
Mm-hmm.
idea, which never really happened, but at least the idea existed, whereas I think the last 3 years have shattered the idea entirely. Like if we had a facade of an international order, if we had a
Mm-hmm.
nice picture of what it could look like, the picture has been burned to ash. That's what we've seen in the last 3 years. That's the difference. Not like here was this great international order that was working and now look, it's been ruined. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, it wasn't really working that well, but something was there and now it's gone entirely. But what the idea of it was is that, indigenous populations have the right to self-determination. We have nation states and borders, and we're supposed to respect those borders. I mean, the basic idea was avoid war.
Mm-hmm.
Avoid war, definitely stop genocide. Like those were the main takeaways. And you create all of these rules in order to do these things. But colonialism wasn't really gone.
Mm-hmm.
So here we had this order, but it didn't work out as well for the states in the region if they didn't align with what powerful interests wanted. And so you get something like the coup, or which is based on the nationalization of oil. So what are the consequences is much more what I could tell you than I could tell you what would happen. We don't know what would happen.
Mm-hmm.
I know it would be different, but I don't know how. I could
Mm-hmm.
tell you, it would be this utopic democracy. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
that as a fact. But the 53 coup helped lead to the 79 revolution, and especially the way that it took shape.
Mm-hmm.
Because it created the conditions that made Iranians that were against the monarchy at the time in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. One thing to keep in mind is when the monarchy came back, when Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was the last Shah, when he was reinstated in 1953, in the sense that he had foreign backing for the fact that he was in power. That foreign backing often people in Iran saw him then as a foreign puppet. And if you look at the language from different dissident groups in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And this is especially because he really came down with an iron fist in the 1950s. The Savak, which is the Iranian secret police, was created in the 1950s after the coup. So those things, the fact that he went after certain parties, especially leftist parties, more of the secular parties, anything that was on the left, that decimated those parties and allowed, others to have more dominance in the space. Even the embassy seizure of 1979 is directly linked
Mm-hmm.
to 1953, which oftentimes people don't know.
Mm-hmm.
When the revolution happens in February of 1979, the US embassy is not seized, and I should say this very clearly. Obviously, a horrific act because again, I believe in international law and order.
Mm-hmm.
So that act in and of itself was wrong, and the fact that Iranian students carried it out. But the logic behind it was why did it happen in November? Like why,
Mm-hmm.
if the revolution happened in February, why all these months was the US embassy just sitting there? Because the Shah was allowed into the United States for medical treatment in October of 1979. And the idea for, real still in this very early revolutionary state was they're going to carry out another coup. It's 1953
Mm-hmm.
all over again. Because where was the location in which the US could organize the coup? The embassy.
Right.
So these things there are historic roots that get us to 1979 looking the way that it did, and that very much comes from 1953.
Mm-hmm.
So do I think the trajectory would be completely different today? Of course. What that would be, I would have a much more difficult time saying.
We always like to ask historians impossible questions here. Um, but so thank you so much for being with us for the last hour and a half. That was a very illuminating conversation, and we really appreciate the time and all the insights that you've given us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and for all of you for staying this long to listen. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get to more of the questions, but this I appreciate everyone who engages in this and I know for anybody who's sitting here right now, this is important to you. That's why you're sitting here right now. This is why you spent 90 minutes of your afternoon
Yeah,
listening to this. So thank you for the work that all of you are doing.
thank you.
Bye.